At this point, you should have already watched the general videotape in Sakai, and we're at number 3 on the agenda list in front of you. You're going to be watching the introductory talk, part 2, in which I'm doing most of the work and introducing to you the 7 categories of the Stanford framework. Once we've done that, I'll give you a chance to apply these categories to some observations that have been made, a sample list that others have made. At this point, we'll not ask you to categorize your own observations, but so we're all on the same page, I'll generate a sample list. So let me introduce for you the heart of our course, and this is the 7 categories. This is going to be the Stanford Educational Framework, 7 ways of looking at the interaction between the teacher and the learner, the teacher and the content, the learner and the content to be learned in the clinical setting. And this framework is going to be based both on educational theory, which we'll review in more detail when you're in town, and educational practice. Here it is. There are 7 items in the educational framework, and right now I'll just read the list. Learning climate, establishing the learning climate, conducting the teaching session, communication of goals, promoting understanding and retention, evaluation, feedback, and promoting self-directed learning. And we're going to be going through each of these things separately. We'll have, in the next 7 slides, 1 slide for each of the categories. We'll go over the basic definitions. And I want to remind you, there will be 7 sessions in this course after this introduction, 1 devoted to each of these 7 categories. So we'll be doing this in depth. The first category is learning climate, and we'll abbreviate that LC. Learning climate, the definition, is the tone or atmosphere of the clinical teaching setting, including whether it's stimulating and whether learners can comfortably identify and address their limitations. For example, will learners disclose to you their discomfort in asking patient-sensitive questions? One of the expectations of a physician in the clinical setting is you sometimes have to ask difficult questions that make the patient and sometimes the physician uncomfortable. If the learner is uncomfortable doing that, are they comfortable enough with us as their teachers that they can say, I'm not comfortable doing this bothers me. So learning climate is the techniques that the teacher does to establish a tone or an atmosphere in the setting in which the learner can comfortably identify and address their limitations. The learning climate has to be stimulating enough that they want to be there. They want to be there learning with you in this situation. But at the same time, that there's not just stimulation, but there's enough comfort that they can identify their own limitations. So that's learning climate. The next is control or conduct of session. This is the leadership style that the teacher uses to keep the teaching session paced and focused. In a sense, it's how the work agenda is set, how business is conducted. For example, in a teaching round setting, who determines what patient will be discussed first? How business is conducted? Who's in control? Is it the attending physician? Is it the resident? Is it a fellow? Is it a student? And how does our own leadership style of the teacher, keep the session paced and focused? So this category, control or conduct of session, is about how a work agenda is set. What are we going to do today? Who's going to do it? When are we going to do it? The next category, communication of goals, is the establishment and explicit expression of a teacher's expectations for the learner. Now this is how the educational agenda is set. For example, how do I explain to a novice what I mean when I say understanding heart failure? I want you to understand heart failure. That's my goal for you. How do we communicate that in a way that a learner, even a beginner, can visualize what success looks like? Now I'm going to compare and contrast communication of goals, this category, with the prior one, conduct of session. Conduct of session is about how the work agenda is set, what I expect of you, what I want you to do. This category, communication of goals, is what I want you to get out of it. This is not what I expect of you, but what I expect for you. and how the teacher establishes those goals with the learner and communicates them. That's category 3. Category 4 is promoting understanding and retention, which we'll abbreviate just UR. Now, this category is very complicated. It deals with the approaches the teacher can use to explain the content being taught and to have the learner meaningfully interact with the content, thus assisting the learner to understand and retain it. Now, there are some definitions here. By explaining, we mean the process of cognitive presentation of facts and concepts. This is how the teacher sets up the material for the learner to interact with it. This is typical didactics. This is the teacher talking. I'm going to explain to you now acid-base balance. I'm going to explain to you now how we examine the heart. Understanding material is the ability to correctly analyze, synthesize, and apply facts and concepts. And then retention, or memory if you want, is the process of remembering facts of concepts. Let me just give you an example to make that distinction clear. Can you remember some facts but not know what they mean? Can you understand something like the clotting cascade without retaining in your mind all of the details? So there's often a distinction between understanding something and remembering. And then the key point here is the things that help us understand typically help us retain. How the teacher explains and gets the learner to interact with the material is critical to those two processes. So that's promoting understanding and retention. Once we've explained something to the students, we've said, here's the goals that we want you to learn. Here are your learning objectives. Here are the goals. Here's the methods. I'm going to have you interact with this material now. The next step, of course, is to make sure that they've learned it. And that's the concept of evaluation. Evaluation, here's the definition. Evaluation is the process by which the teacher assesses the learner's progress in knowledge, skills, and attitudes based on educational goals. Assessing progress based on educational goals. Here's an example. With this patient today, where is this intern in their progression from reporter to interpreter to manager educator? Let's say I have the goals that the students progressively move from understanding to action, from reporter, interpreter to manager, educator. How today do I figure out where this intern is in that progress? My goal is that they progress from understanding into action, from reporter, interpreter into manager, educator. How do I figure out where they are? That's what this category of evaluation is about and the many techniques for doing this. Suppose I say that the learner is not making the progress I expect. What do I do then? Well, of course, I give feedback, which is our 6th of the 7 categories. Feedback is the process by which the teacher provides information to the learner for the purpose of improving the learner's performance. For example, is this resident able to identify what he or she would like feedback on? In progress towards independence, a resident should be able to assess what they're doing well and what they're not doing well. They should be able to have some idea of what they know and what they don't know. They should be able to say to me as the attending, here's what I'd like some feedback on. That's a form of interactive feedback. Overall, the process of feedback is the teacher giving information to the learner for the purpose of improving performance. It should be clear at this point that the purpose of giving feedback is not to help the learner feel bad or to help the learner feel good. The purpose is to improve performance. If we do it well and the learning climate is strong, then they will probably end up feeling better about themselves. But the purpose of feedback is to improve performance. And we'll talk about the many techniques that have been used to give effective feedback. As I've said several times, the goal is the transition from understanding into action. The goal is the transition to the independence of the learner. And by the end of the process, the learner should be able to learn on their own. And hence, our final category is the teacher's techniques for promoting self-directed learning, which we'll abbreviate SDL. Definition: self-directed learning is the form of learning initiated by the individual learner's needs, interests, and goals. Not determined by the teacher. Form of learning initiated by the learner based on their needs, interests, and goals. Second bullet, this category deals with the approaches the teacher can use to influence motivation and influence the use of resources, thereby fostering self-directed learning. The example I give is this resident learning independently? It's an evaluation question. And how can I prompt that? So self-directed learning is, if you will, the final goal of all of the education that we do, helping the learner to become independent. So we have our 7 categories in our framework, and we need to apply this to the real world. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate how the categories apply to some observations made by others who have seen the videotape you just watched. You just watched a videotape of about 5 minutes of an attending rounds with an attending medical student, 2 interns, and a resident. And I'm going to show you some sample observations made by others who have seen those tapes. Then, second bullet on this screen, you will apply the 7 categories to your own observations. You'll stop the tape and you'll classify your own observations. But now we're going to review the 7, see how the 7 categories apply to this framework, to the real-world teaching situation. So at this point, we're going to use the sample list. I'm on the bottom of the slide here. Sample list of teaching behaviors from others who have watched this general tape in the past. Typically, when I have a group of 5 to 10 people watching this tape, we can generate a list of 20 or 30 different observations. And you may have written down 5 or so yourselves. I'm going to show you a list of about 10 or so behaviors that have been people have found in the past on the tape. So here's the items. Let's start on the left. We'll read through these and then we'll classify them. First, up here on the upper left, the attending woke up the intern. Number 2, the resident belittled the student. Resident made fun of the student's comment about the quality of the medical records of others. The attending emphasized the basics for the student. When the student was struggling, the attending said, okay, just the simple things first. Next bullet. What were the interns and residents supposed to get out of the session? Since the attending focused on the student, people often ask, well, what were the interns and residents supposed to get out of this? How was the case selected for presentation? An observation, bottom left there, is that the student wasn't very well prepared. Upper right, was the student aware of how badly he was doing? Boy, the attending was really patient with this student who was struggling. Next bullet, the attending asked the student a lot of questions. The attending ignored the other intern and the resident. And a final example, I hope the resident gets the students into shape for next time. So there's 11 different observations that might be made about this tape, and now I'm going to show you how we classify them. So this is the list that was on the left. The first one is that the attending woke up the intern. Well, the attending was attempting to involve the intern in the conversation, and the concept of involvement has to do with learning climate and being stimulated. So we're going to call that one LC. The resident belittled the student. When the student said, the notes from the other hospital weren't as good, the resident said, speak for yourself because we're not all that good. That's another learning climate issue. It has to do with the comfort of the student and whether the student is going to be willing to admit their own mistakes when they get belittled, when they make any kind of a comment. The next one down, the third on the list, the attending emphasized the basics. This has to do with the concept of understanding and retention, how the teacher explains things, how you emphasize the basics as opposed to more elaborate things. So we're going to put that one in the category of UR, understanding and retention. The next one is, what were the interns and residents supposed to get out of the session? This is communication of goals. The question here is, what were the goals for the intern and the resident? The next one, how was the case for presentation selected? Who decided what the agenda was going to be and what we were going to do? Did the attending decide? Did the resident decide? Did the student ask? how business was conducted, how the work agenda was set. That's what we call conduct or control of session, CS. When we observe that the student wasn't well prepared, that's an evaluation, isn't it? This student is not quite where we want them to be. And so that category of evaluation deals with how do we reach that conclusion, what observations do we make? Let's go to the next 5. Was the student aware of how bad he was doing, or how badly he was doing? To give myself some feedback on my grammar. Well, that's a feedback question. Did anyone say to the student, you're not well prepared, either before or during the session? It's a feedback issue. For the student to be aware of how he was doing very often takes feedback. The attending was patient with the student. Patience, not interrupting. This has to do with helping the student address their limitations, and so we're going to place it in the category of learning climate. The attending asked the student a lot of questions. Well, that's clearly evaluation. When you're asking a lot of questions to figure out what someone knows, you're evaluating them. The attending ignored the other intern and the resident. Well, if they're not involved, that's a learning climate issue. It could also be a control of session or a conduct of session issue if they're not involved in the agenda. But people not being involved is usually a matter of the learning climate. The final comment, I hope this student figures things out. Well, this gets at the question, what is the student going to do next? Are they capable of learning on their own? And that makes it in the category of self-directed learning. So what I've briefly done here is given some sample observations that people have made about the tape and show how we use the framework, the analytic framework of the categories to analyze the teaching situation. Now, I have to make some comments about this framework and all frameworks. Any framework, including this framework of 7, have limitations. These are an attempt to pose some kind of order on a complex reality. So I don't want you to think that the 7 categories is the only way of looking at the relationship between the teacher and the learner. In fact, it's a way of analyzing what we see in the session, or what we see ourselves doing when we're teaching. Which category you classify something at could depend on the teacher's intention. So if, for instance, the teacher asks a question to diagnose the learner, to figure out what the learner knows, then that's in the category of evaluation. We're trying to figure out what the learner knows. But suppose the teacher knows that the student can't answer the question, and they're really asking the question to help the student lead to a conclusion. In other words, it's a teaching device. It's not really being done to evaluate the student, but to lead the student. And then we're in the category of understanding retention. And the example that I just gave a moment ago, when the teacher doesn't involve the intern and the resident in the conversation with the student, I classified that as a learning climate issue because they were not involved, and involvement is a learning climate issue. But you could also say it was an agenda setting issue when if it had been agreed upon that the student would be the focus of the session and not others. So that's a brief introduction to our framework. Now, I'm going to ask you to apply this framework yourself. What you're going to do is to go to Sakai, where there is a link to a Google spreadsheet in which you can write down under each category, each of the 7 categories, learning climate, conduct of session, communication of goals, your own observations about the teaching session you just watched. In other words, if you say the resident was rude to the student, you would write that down in the column LC. If you said the teacher was asked a lot of questions of the student to figure out what the student knew, you would put that down under evaluation. I want to emphasize here that this is not always perfectly right or wrong. What I'm trying to do is to get you to be familiar with the framework. Now we're going to discuss all the entries of all of you who are sitting and watching this tape in the Adobe Connect session of July 10th. We won't know at that point who wrote what. It doesn't really matter. I suspect there'll be a fair amount of overlap between you, and if you go to the spreadsheet and you see something that the comment of waking up the sleeping intern had already been made, you don't need to repeat it again. We only need to have it there once. You're not being scored in this. So what I want you to do now is you'll stop this video, you'll go to the Sakai spreadsheet, and you'll enter in the Sakai spreadsheet your own observations, and then you will, when you've done with that, return to this introduction. So that ends this part of the introduction. You now go to the Sakai website and go to the Google spreadsheet. Thanks very much. Well, at this point, you've just completed step number 4. You've applied the categories to your own observations. You've picked a category for each of your observations and posted them to the Sakai website. And then we will review these at the Adobe Connect section. And now you're at the final 4.2. You've returned to this introductory video, and we're just about done. Final exercise is I want you to look at the comment you wrote down at the very start of this session about your own memorable teacher. And my question for you is, which of the 7 categories of teaching that you noted about this teacher, which applies? So if you said your teacher explained things very well, you'd be in the category of understanding and retention. If you said this teacher was great at asking questions to figure out what you knew, then you're in the category of evaluation. No right answer here. This is an attempt to get you to be familiar with the framework, and we're not going to post these to Sakai or discuss them. If you wish, when I talk to you in person, you can ask me about this further. We can discuss them when we have our Adobe Connect session on July 10th. So we're just about done, and here are our next steps. Now that we have finished the general introduction, we're going to go over each of the category in depth. We're going to talk about definition, concepts, and behaviors. As I mentioned, the first one is going to be learning climate. And just to help you anticipate, I'm going to talk about the structure of how we'll go through each of those categories. So the major activities for each category is first is going to be the mini lecture, and you're going to watch me give a short talk of 20 to 30 minutes on tape. At the end of watching that short tape that, say, introduces the category of learning climate, you're going to do a video review. You'll go to the Sakai website, you'll observe a tape of a teaching session with an attending, and then you're going to write down your replies to 1 or 2 simple questions about the attending behaviors, like what worked, what didn't work, and why. Then at the end of that, I'll have you write down a teaching behavior for your own personal goals, and which you may be practicing them on your own program when you get back home. So those are the major activities that you'll do before you arrive in town. Then when you're here in residence, we're going to do a role play for a learning climate, and we'll have assigned roles. Somebody will be an attending, somebody will be a student, somebody will be a resident in a teaching situation, and the person who is acting as the teacher will apply the category to a particular challenging teaching situation. So that will be the role play. That will only happen when we're back here in residence, and we'll do 1 role play for each of the 7 categories. After we've done the role play, which I'll tape, we'll watch the video. And we'll ask the teacher, the person who's playing the teacher in the session, to reflect on his or her teaching practice in the session. What did you do? What was the intention when you did that particular behavior? When you asked the learner not to do something, or you gave feedback, what was your intention? And did you get what you wanted? Did the intern or the student in the videotape role play reply as you wanted? And then finally, you will do some readings. We'll have readings. There'll be 1 or 2 required readings for each of the 7 categories, and then some optional ones. And this will give us a chance to explore the theory underlying each category, and we'll have some simple questions about the readings. So those are the major activities for each of the 7 categories. This is the way the typical session will be structured. If you look over here on the right, mini lecture, video review, goal cards, and readings. And then on the left you see the purpose of those activities: to define the educational concepts and name the components, to recognize the teaching behaviors, to apply the concepts personally and to your institution, and to pursue the topic in depth. Now let's have an overview of the whole program and essentially what is this all about, instructional methods in the clinical situation. It's about bringing out the best in learners. There are 3 pillars to this kind of leadership in the academic clinical setting. First is creating the right atmosphere, the right setting. And the key category here is learning climate, which is based on trust, an attitudinal issue. And the second pillar in bringing out the best in people is setting out expectations. This is the category of communicating goals, in which clarity in the expression of goals is very important. This is, if you will, a cognitive issue. Finally, improving performance requires feedback, which is a critical skill that everyone needs. These categories are really the basis of educational leadership. And at this point, I just want to mention that teaching and leadership are, for our purposes, very similar activities. In fact, the word education has as its Latin root the phrase educere, which means to lead out of a dependent state. And you're all familiar with the word pedagogy, which is just the Greek equivalent of this, pedagogein, which means to lead a child. The whole purpose of the educational process is to lead someone out of a dependent state to an independent state, to move from understanding into action, from reporter-interpreter into manager-educator, towards independence. So those 3 pillars, learning climate, communicating goals, and feedback, are kind of the pillars of leadership and the pillars of teaching. So you've just finished this introduction video. Thanks very much. Before the Adobe Connect session, when we're all together on July 10th, please make sure you watch the following videos for learning climate, conduct of session, and communication of goals. We'll be discussing those at our first Adobe Connect session. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoy the course. I'm glad to have you working with me.